Welcome to part two of a four-part lecture on qualitative interviewing with me, Victoria Clark. In this part, we're going to focus on designing interview guides and preparing for interviews to get the most out of them. Please do skip the next few slides if you want to, if you've heard all this before. So these materials have been created by Virginia or Ginny Braun pictured on the left, me, Victoria Clark, in the middle, and Nikki Hayfield pictured on the right as part of a collaboration developing online teaching and learning resources for qualitative methods. So to overview the topic of this four-part lecture, we're going to set out different types of research interviews and identify when interviews will be a suitable method of data generation for qualitative research. And this is something that we've addressed in part one. In part two, we're going to explore good practice for designing an interview guide and to consider how to prepare for and get the most out of interviews. In part one, we also looked at some of the advantages and disadvantages of interviews. In part three, we're going to explore some other possibilities for interview designs beyond conventional in-person, one-on-one seated interviews, and also reflect on practice. And then in the final optional part four, we're going to focus on transcribing audio data. So in terms of the four-part lecture structure, we're now on part two, designing interview guides and preparing for the interview. So let's think about constructing interview guides, and we use the word guide rather than schedule as that sounds a bit softer and more fluid. Schedule sounds a bit sort of structured and doesn't really evoke kind of qualitative research. So as qualitative researchers, we're constantly thinking about the language that we use to describe our practice. So your interview guide will always hinge on your research question. So there's a kind of a dialogue between your interview guide and your research question. What is it I'm exploring and I want to know, and so on. So you need to think about the purpose of the interview and how you translate your research questions into questions for participants. You're not going to go to the interview with your research question and pose that to participants. That will probably be too broad or not appropriate. So you need to think about what questions can I ask that will get the participant talking about the things that are relevant to and interesting to my research question, will help me address my research question. So you want to generate conversation, not general information. So it's not a fact-finding kind of mission. Do you know the sky is blue? Do you know grass is green? And so on. You're kind of trying to get people to share and reflect on experiences and feelings and perspectives. So in terms of the structure of the interview, you want some kind of opener, some kind of blurb, and it's a good idea to kind of practice a blurb or make notes for a blurb and think about the things you need to highlight for participants. So you want to highlight practicalities like, you can stop the interview at any point, you're free to decline to answer any question, you don't need to give a reason for this, blah, 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 those kind of practical things, but also a sense of what I'm interested in and why am I doing this kind of research. In less structured interviews, you'll have a list of topics. In what are typically known as kind of semi-structured interviews, but we've tended to move away from that language, you'll probably have a series of questions and kind of prompts and so on. And often this is referred to as an interview guide approach rather than a semi-structured approach, in that you have a series of questions or topics that guide the conversation, and you're aiming for about an hour's kind of roughly dialogue with the participant. Obviously it depends on the participant group. If it's children, young children in particular, it's going to be a lot shorter, and so on. So what things do you need to think about when designing an interview guide? You obviously want to start off gently. You don't want to jump into the most difficult, challenge, threatening, sensitive questions that you have. So you want to ease the participant into the process, and you also want to finish in an open way. So always include what other people call a clean-up question. So is there anything else you want to share? Is there anything else you want to tell me? Is there anything you thought I'd ask about but I haven't? To give people the opportunity to raise things that you haven't anticipated, you haven't asked about. And sometimes the answers to this question can be really illuminating. You want to make sure that people understand your question, that they're accessible, that they can actually answer them, that they have experience that will help them, or views that will help them to answer the question. And you want to keep them as open as possible, so you're not building into assumptions into the question or lead people into kind of particular answers. So try to frame questions conversationally. Can you tell me about? And invite lengthy answers, and try not to assume too much. So try not to build assumptions into the questions. And also, the way you manage the interview will encourage people to talk at length. So goggles, aha, will kind of invite people to keep going. Think about different ways of asking questions, or different ways of kind of tackling issues. So sometimes you'll find that one question doesn't really work, but then you ask about the similar issue in a slightly different way, and that really gets people to talk and open up. And allow space for participants to talk about what's important for them, but also keep in mind the need to keep the interview kind of on target. Think about prompts and interjections, and how you might encourage people to kind of say more or share more. That's really interesting. Can you tell me more about that? I'd really like to know more about that. Obviously, think about leading questions. You don't want to ideally kind of lead participants because you're kind of imposing your agenda on things, but sometimes kind of hypothetical questions, what do you think of blah blah blah, or if this happened, or other participants have said X, what do you think about this? Sometimes they can kind of provoke good discussion. There are kind of rules for writing interview guides, and then I think you can break the rules, as long as you understand the rules and understand what it is you're doing. Try and keep your questions in a logical order, but when you come to do the interview, you're just going to abandon your guide and you're going to follow the participant. And if they raise something that you'd plan to ask about later on, don't say, oh, that's really interesting, I've got a question about that later. Talk about it when they raise it. So the interview itself will be sort of messy, whereas the guide will look quite logical and quite planned. But the joy of a qualitative approach and interview guide approach is that you can follow the participant rather than follow the guide. And think about how many questions you want to have, how many you think you'll need to explore the issue fully, and have an in-depth conversation for around an hour. So Crail, I never know how to pronounce his name correctly, but hopefully that's a broad approximation. Types of interview questions. He talked about different types of interview questions. So introducing questions, where you introduce a topic. Follow-up questions, where you ask for more, similar to kind of probing questions, where you're asking for more detail. Specifying questions, when you're wanting people to kind of focus on particular things. Questions that are more direct or indirect, or hypothetical or projective. Questions that are structuring. So I've asked you about X, we're now going to move on to the next portion of the interview where we talk about Y. To start with, can you tell me about? Silence, so the technique of the journalist to just stay silent. And it's intended to communicate to participants that they have permission to continue talking. I think when we're new interviewers and we feel quite nervous, we often rush on to the next question on the guide rather than allow kind of silences to develop. And there's also kind of interpreting questions. So I think what you're saying is X, Y, and Z. Is that right? So kind of feeding back and trying to communicate to the participant what you've understood of what they're saying. And some other types of questions that Crail mentions include descriptive questions, so getting people to describe things, behavioural or experiential questions, getting them to talk about what they did or how they behaved in a particular situation, questions that orient to emotion and affect, questions that orient to kind of cognition and thought, so what do you think about? Whereas emotion would be, how did that make you feel? And evaluative questions, inviting people to kind of reflect on and interpret things. So this is a useful checklist for thinking about what dimension do I want people to focus on? How do I make sure the wording signals to participants that that's what I want them to talk about? So if you want them to talk about feelings and emotions, you wouldn't ask a how do you think question, you'd ask a how do you feel question. And if you want a cognition question, how do you think blah blah blah. So use this checklist to kind of think about your draft of your interview guide, and are you asking and are you wording questions in a way that kind of gets at and cues people to talk about what it is you want them to kind of share. So some more tips for constructing interview guides. So try and keep questions short. You don't want really long rambling questions that are hard for participants to follow. Really tricky to avoid in practice, but it's really helpful if questions are short. And if you only ask people one thing at a time, when you're, I don't know, you're phoning your bank and they ask you for your date of birth and your postcode, and my brain always has this like thing because you're being asked a double question to retain two elements, and you want to kind of avoid that in interviews. You want to give people one question at a time, because people can not answer one element because they just forget, or they can not answer one element because they don't really want to talk about that, which is fine, and obviously they're perfectly entitled to do. Or people might say, which bit would you like me to answer first? And then that's when you know you've asked a double question. Again, as we've mentioned, keeping those questions open. It can be really hard to word questions in an open way, so it's worth kind of checking, are these open? Avoid kind of being overly formal. So this is a conversation, it's not something, it's not job interview, so keep the tone kind of appropriately informal, and avoid kind of jargon or abbreviations that participants might not understand. You want to check people understand things before you kind of go in with abbreviations and jargon. One piece of advice that lots of people suggest you avoid is why questions. So because obviously it depends on how you ask them, it depends on the tone, but they can come across as a bit blunt and a bit threatening. As I've mentioned, you want your catch-all or your clean-up question. And a really important thing is being attentive to participants' use of language. So if there's kind of contested terminology or different ways of talking about things, and if a term is really important to the interview, it can be useful to kind of check in at the start at what term the participant feels comfortable using, and using that kind of throughout the interview. When you get to part 3, you'll there'll be a reflection that relates to the following bit of advice about being naive. So it's strategic naivety in the sense that you're asking people to explain things. I used to work with a family therapist who was an amazing interviewer, and she'd often say, for the tape, this was back in the days when we used audio tapes, so a long time ago, for the tape, tell me for the tape. So she'd understand what people were talking about, but she'd want to get their kind of explanation in their own words. And this is a really important consideration where you're an insider researcher and you understand what it is people are saying, you understand the ideas that they're kind of talking about, and you don't get them to unpack them in a way that an outsider researcher who perhaps didn't have that intimate kind of shared knowledge would do. So it's important to hold on to that and think about, oh, actually, I understand what they're talking about, but I need to get them to explain it in their own words. Reflecting back can be useful to check that you've understood. So if you're not sure if you understand what someone's saying, it can be, so you're saying blah, 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 have I understood you correctly? It can be helpful, but it's often not a great technique for generating useful data. And if you do it a lot, it can give the interview quite a kind of staccato stop-start kind of rhythm. It kind of loses flow, and often if you've got it right, the participant just said yes, and that doesn't really give you anything in terms of data. Sometimes it can be a useful kind of prompt to get people to talk more, but it's worth kind of holding on to the fact that reflecting back can be a mixed kind of tool, in the sense that sometimes it works really well. It helps you to check understanding. Sometimes it can prompt people to say more, and then sometimes it just kind of shut things down and you don't get any useful kind of data from it. One thing you want to do when you're developing your guide is kind of take a step back and ask yourself some critical questions. So things like, what am I trying to achieve with this question? So what am I trying to get at? What am I hoping that not exactly what they're going to say, but what might they talk about? a really useful one, particularly if you're an insider researcher, is how would I feel if I was asked this? Would this feel okay? Would this feel comfortable? Would I want to answer this question? And to use your imagination, how are interviewees from different backgrounds likely to feel if they're asked this question? This might be a bit speculative, particularly if you're thinking about participants with identities you don't share, but this can be really useful to think about how's this question going to land with different people. Another one is, will they be able to answer it? Like, will they have the information or the experience or the perspectives to be able to meaningfully engage with this question? Is the language clear? Is it understandable? Will people understand what I'm getting at? Sometimes if questions are too sort of open, they can be a bit vague. So I opened a question with tell me about your family and often got, well, what do you mean? Or what do you want us to talk about? So that was too broad, too vague, didn't give people enough information about what I wanted them to share. You might want to think about if the question's leading in any way, and do the words that you're using encourage participants to answer in particular ways? So this goes back to that sort of useful cognition emotion distinction. Are you using words that lead people to talk about their thoughts and beliefs, or words to talk about their emotions and their feelings? So it's good to have a pause and ask yourself some critical questions in relation to the guide that you've developed. So now we have an activity related to interview guides. So we'd like you to read the questions on the interview guide on the next two slides and reflect on the following. What are the strengths of the guide? Are there any ways in which you could improve on it? And would you change any of the questions? And if so, in what way and for what reasons? So I'm not going to read through the questions. I will allow you to pause the recording, read through the questions and reflect on the questions. And they're questions on social class modified from an actual interview guide. And here's the second slide of the interview guide with questions on class. So please pause the recording now if you'd like to engage in this activity. So let's think about practical planning issues. Obviously, you need to think about the interview modality, and we'll talk more about this in part 3, and whether you give participants a choice of modality, if you're meeting in person, where you're going to meet and when you'll meet, and if it's a video call, where you'll be and what background you'll be using. Obviously, you need to prepare your interview guide, but be prepared to kind of set it aside and focus on the participant and the interview itself. The process of developing the guide really helps you to think through in detail what it is you want people to kind of talk about and reflect on, and how you think you're able to get them to do it. So it's you're not sort of developing a perfect guide that will then exactly guide the interview. Developing the interview guide is a kind of process of preparing for the interview. You need to think about how you're going to record the interview, how you're going to transcribe it, and what notation system you'll use. This is something that's covered in part 4. And obviously you need to leave plenty of time for analysing the data. There are also ethical issues to consider in planning. So thinking about the relationship between you and the participant. If you have a pre-existing relationship, when they become your participant, you're entering to a dual or a multiple relationship, and you need to think around the ethical dimensions of that. You also need to think about your own social identity. If you're an insider researcher, are you going to share that with participants? Do you think that will be helpful to build trust and rapport? Equally, if you're an outsider, it could be useful to disclose that. Obviously, you need an information sheet to fully inform participants and a privacy notice. You need to seek informed consent. Are you going to do that in person? If you're meeting in person, will you do it in advance with a Qualitative survey? You need to think about confidentiality and anonymity. Need to think about how you address more sensitive topics, and if there's a risk of participant distress, if that happens, how are you going to manage it? So there's lots of things you want to think through in advance of the interview itself, so you're well prepared for the interview encounter. In terms of finding participants, you need to think about who you're going to recruit, so your inclusion and exclusion criteria, and how you're going to go about recruiting them. how available they might be, how willing they might be to take part in an interview. Will your participants have an hour to spend with a researcher? And you need to think about practicalities like age and language and location. Like if they're geographically dispersed and you don't have a huge travel budget, then obviously you're going to need to think about virtual interviews. If they're older or younger, you might want to think about modality in relation to age and having a good fit between the age of the participant group and the interview modality. One dimension that people often think about in terms of the constitution of participant groups is, these are two words I always struggle to say, heterogeneity and homogeneity. So are people going to be diverse and different, or are they going to be similar? And if they're similar, in what ways are they going to be similar? If they're different, in what ways? And this can relate to kind of demographic characteristics, political standpoints, and life experiences. And you also need to think about the size of the participant group. So with larger groups, you can capture more diversity within the participant group. You have more data for developing themes. And if you want to publish your research, journals often like larger participant groups. Smaller groups, though, can be easier to handle, so less demanding in terms of time and resources, things like transcription or checking automated transcription and analysis and so on. And smaller groups might enable you to focus more in depth on people's individual kind of lived experiences. So again, participant group size will relate to things like your method of analysis. So IPA tends to have smaller samples, for example, interpretive phenomenological analysis. Thematic analysis tends to have slightly bigger samples, but there's obviously overlaps and intersections. So there's lots to think about in terms of the participant group, how they're going to be constituted, and how many participants you need and how you're going to find them. So in terms of your before the day and on the day preparation, obviously well in advance, you'll have your information sheets, privacy notice, consent and demographic forms ready to go. You might want to think about whether you pilot your interview guide. Piloting is normally something that happens in large scale funded research where there's plenty of time and resources to recruit people specifically to pilot the interview guide, and then you discard those interviews. In small scale projects, that's not really a realistic possibility. So instead, I like the idea of what I call a kind of soft pilot, where you do 1 or 2 interviews, you transcribe them, and then you pause with your supervisor to reflect on the interviews, think about what's working well, what is working less well. If there's some new question areas you want to introduce, some things aren't working and you want to take them out, those interviews will form part of your data set, but you might make changes to the interview guide in the interviews going forward. And qualitative research isn't hugely concerned with, well, non-positivist or big Q qualitative research isn't hugely concerned with structure and standardization. So you can have that more kind of fluid and evolving approach. It can be really helpful to practice your opening and your closing blurbs, particularly the opening blurb. That can help you feel confident at the start. Do plan your time carefully. Absolute maximum 2 interviews a day, ideally 1 interview a day. They can be really draining encounters. I always think of the best way to think about being an interviewer is a duck swimming across a pond. From the outside, from the surface, the duck looks really serene, kind of gliding across the surface of the pond, and that's how you'll appear to the participants, that you're calm, you're relaxed, you're asking them questions, you're listening attentively. What's going on inside your head is, oh, they talked about that, I won't need to ask about that later. Oh, that's really interesting, I'm going to follow up on that. So you're kind of doing a lot of thinking whilst you're sitting there looking attentive and listening really hard to what people are saying. Record interviews where possible. Most qualitative analytic approaches require recording of interviews. So it's really important to make sure that participants know in advance that interviews will be recorded. However you're recording, whether it's on Teams or using some kind of recording device, check the equipment, make sure you understand how it works, do it a few times so you feel really confident about that. Think about potential background noises and distractions that might take place, dogs, cats, children, and have a plan for kind of managing those. They might be your own dogs and cats and children or the participants. Think about the location. So if you're meeting in person, think about where you're going to meet. If you're meeting virtually on Teams, for example, think about where you're going to be, where the participant's going to be, your background, and so on. If you are meeting participants in person, we tend to use something that's called a safety buddy system. If you're on UE campus, that's absolutely fine. You don't need that. But if you're going off campus, you would normally give someone who's available on the day of the interview in an envelope the contact details and the name of the participant. So you're maintaining participant confidentiality. You'll arrange to call the safety buddy before and after the interview. And if they don't hear from you, they've got contact information so they can raise the alarm if necessary. So this is something that you'd put on your risk assessment when you're developing your ethics application. A word you'll hear about a lot when you read about interviewing is rapport, the need to establish a rapport with participants. But as Shaw says here, as someone who regularly says this, I realise how difficult it is to explain how to go about doing it. And there isn't really a sort of a recipe or a rule book for developing rapport. It's partly about being yourself in an interview and understanding who you are, what type of interviewer you are. It's about using your social skills, your skills of kind of human empathy to make people feel comfortable and relaxed with you. So it's thinking about you're not just there to kind of extract information from someone, you're there to kind of develop a relationship with them, and how you're going to go about doing that, and how you're going to go about doing that if they're not very talkative, if they're quite quiet. Some people are very kind of warm and bubbly and outgoing, and developing rapport can feel really easy. With other people it can feel less straightforward. So it's worth thinking about, how am I going to do this? How am I going to develop a rapport with this person? So now we're going to invite you to do just that, to pause for a moment and think about what techniques, what strategies you can use for developing rapport with participants. So if you'd like to have a go at this, pause the recording now. So finally, let's think about making the most of data generation and how you get people to talk. So think about the order of questions. So I mentioned earlier about starting off gently and building up to the more sensitive and intrusive and probing questions. Avoid kind of doing expert and positioning yourself as expert. And during the interview, you want to be a good listener and show that you're listening to the participants. To be empathic, obviously, and not kind of judgmental, or to show interest in what the participant is saying. Sometimes an empathic style can contrast with an interest style of interviewing. You want to allow the participant's worldview to kind of come to the fore, so you're not kind of imposing your assumptions and ideas onto the interview. And if the interviewee doesn't understand the question, give them some time to think it through, kind of repeat it or paraphrase it, emphasize a particular word. If they don't really understand what you're asking about, then kind of move on to something else. And you can also use prompts and probes. So ask people to, tell you a bit, can you tell me a bit more about that? If you want to kind of use enthusiasm, that's really interesting. I'd love to hear more about that. Ask for clarification, pick up on a particular word they've said and ask them to kind of explain what they mean. Goggles we've mentioned, yeah, right, nodding, etc. Using body language to convey interest and that you're kind of listening to people. So there's lots of things that you can do to develop rapport, to put people at ease, and to help them feel comfortable talking to you. So here we are at the end of part 2, and here are the references for part 2, and I will meet you again for part 3.